So, hello, everybody. Today we are meeting for the MCAA Around the World webinar series with MCAA Switzerland chapter this time. The title of our webinar is Exploring the Vital Role of Science Diplomacy and Evidence-Based Policy in Educating Future Scientists. So why the science diplomacy is a very important field that has a rapid expansion and growing importance with international scientific and diplomatic communities. So this webinar, we delve in the crucial role of science diplomacy and evidence-based policy in shaping the education, especially for future scientists. So we are going to have a in-depth, as much as possible, discussion with our experts who will share with us insights, case studies, possible strategies, how to integrate science diplomacy and evidence-based policy in the education of the next generation scientists. So this webinar is especially important for young scientists that would like to engage in the intersection of science and international relations. So our speakers, a short introduction. They have very rich CV. So we start with Professor Paul Bergman, that is founder of the Science Diplomacy Center and a fellow of International Science Council. He is also a faculty associate with the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School and associate director of Science Diplomacy in the Harvard MIT Public Dispute Program, as well as a fellow with the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, the so-called UNITA. Our second speaker is Ralph Mitzke. He's a research assistant to Professor Dr. Maria Denzi of Science, Technology and Gender Studies at the Friedrich Alexander Universität Erlangen-Nuremberg. He's a member of the European Science Diplomacy Alliance, especially in the Task Force for Capacity Building, and has been appointed by European Commission to EU Science Diplomacy Working Group that is dealing with the building capacity for European science diplomacy. And Dr. Giovanna Militz, that is going to join us soon, is assistant professor and Swiss National Science Foundation Prima Fellow of the Adolf Merck Institute at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. She is also executive board member of the Swiss Young Academy, co-leading the Science Young Network for Science Policy and Diplomacy, and is going to talk about their activities. So the agenda for today, after my short introduction, we'll start with a talk by Professor Paul Bergman. The title of his talk is about capacity building with next generation science diplomats, has 20 minutes. And after that, probably we're going to have a short, we take short questions for Professor Paul Bergman, because he's going to leave after, I think, 45 minutes after the webinar. So he's not going to stay until the end, where we are going to have our normal Q&A. And then we are continuing with Ralph Mitzke about bypassing the gatekeepers, science diplomacy as productive divergence. And we continue with Dr. Giovanna Militz about the Swiss Young Network for Science Diplomacy, Policy and Diplomacy. And then we end up with about 20 minutes questions and answers. So please write in the chat for all participants in the audience your questions, and we are going to go through them at the end of the meeting. So we have already a list of questions that we have asked our speakers, but feel free also to add yours. So that was most general questions that I could think about. So I will stop. I can send you the slides later. Is basic information about the Swiss chapter, the goals in the MCAA, and we have social media where you can join and also send us email if you want to join the group. And we have associations with different working groups in MCAA and outside, for example, with Science Diplomacy Alliance. So thank you very much for your time. And now Let's start with Professor Paul Arthur Bergman. Please, you can start sharing your slides and you can start with your talk. Please unmute yourself.
Oh. Hello, everybody. In the process of getting slides sharing.
Share screen.
There it is. Share. Good.
Yeah.
You can see okay?
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Theodata, for the opportunity to contribute to a very important, I would say, essential discussion with leadership from the Marie Curie Association. So I appreciate your leadership in this.
Sorry for the interruption. If you want, you can make them a bigger screen, full screen, your slides, so that people can see.
Display swap. Is this better? Is this bigger now?
It's not yet.
Swap, is that? Are you able to see my slides?
Yes, but not in big screen as before.
The presentation, we see the presenter screen, so maybe you have to swap the monitors or the screens.
Yeah, is that bigger? Toggle camera?
A bit.
No. Well, let us begin in any case. I
yeah,
apologize.
Please.
I apologize for the
now we lost your slides. Sorry for
now you lost my slides. Well, that's okay. Let's see.
Please try to share them again, and then we can just watch as you had them before. It's fine.
So, are you seeing my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Share screen. Okay. Share screen.
I, from a part, can say that Paul is also a great narrator. So
now we can. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It's
now you
excellent
can see.
to have. Yes, we can see.
Okay.
And there is a small button at the bottom
so
that is screen.
Slideshow.
Yeah.
From beginning. Display screens. Is that good? Okay.
It's okay. Yes. Now it's full screen. Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you. You can start.
Oh, very good. So it's an honor as well as pleasure to, and I would say I feel responsibility as well to share observations about science diplomacy and its contribution to the world we live in today and forever into the future. So I'd like you to think about the word forever throughout this discussion, because that's the challenge we face collectively. All 8 billion of us today and however many billion into the future. So the story I'm going to tell you, this is a random PowerPoint. It's the most recent PowerPoint that I shared, and it in itself is a good way to start the story. This presentation was with the International Law Program at MGIMO University in Moscow. So in terms of science diplomacy and diplomacy in a general sense, it involves dialogues among allies for sure, but also with adversaries. The challenge is to be in a position to have those types of dialogues, to facilitate those types of dialogues. And so in this instance, MGIMO University is considered to be the Harvard of Russia, according to Henry Kissinger. But the International Law Program at MGIMO trains about 93% of the people that enter the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's a significant contribution to Russian international relations. So in the process of building relationship with MGIMO University, which started with the first formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic, which I co-convened with the director of the International Law Program at MGIMO in 2010 at Cambridge University. And that dialogue opened the door to discussions, continuous discussions, transparent, inclusive discussions, including, for example, the baseline of Russian Arctic laws that was published in English with all of Russian Arctic laws back to the beginning of the 18th century, 19th century. So the dialogue here is an illustration of the challenge that we individually and collectively face to provide continuity in dialogues that relate to science, to relate to understanding change in our world, natural sciences, social sciences, and indigenous knowledge, all of which have their own methodologies, experiments with natural sciences, testing hypotheses with controls, values and ethics with social sciences, and cultural knowledge with indigenous knowledge. All of those different methodologies have been used throughout history over millennia for the purposes of making decisions, decisions that relate to change in our world. Change in our world operates at all kinds of scales, some that we are increasingly able to see because we have satellites, for example, and can visualize the entire world in synoptic context. And so the challenge is, in a sense, to enable future generations of science diplomats, individuals who have the capacity to serve as brokers of dialogue between allies and adversaries alike. The context of this is, in a general sense, called open science. Open science is inclusive: who, what, when, where, why, and how, on an international scale, globally. And the challenge is to be inclusive. We cannot study climate, for example, if we decide which part of the world we're going to study and with whom we're going to partner. These are global discussions, things like the transmission of a pandemic, issues of high technology. All of them fundamentally involve science. We understand change. That is the nature of science. We study change, whether it's natural science methods or social science methods or indigenous knowledge methods. We study change. That is our contribution to the world in a very basic sense. It's always been there. And the challenge is to use that understanding of time, how time operates, to assist our world at local to global scales, personal to planetary, about how we operate on a planetary scale forever, which was the question in the beginning. How do we deal with forever? And I can show a few more slides and give you a bit of background on myself, but just for briefly, this is where I started when I was 22, scuba diving in Antarctica for a year on an expedition with Scripps Institution of Oceanography, studying giant single-celled animals on the seafloor. And during that year, I asked myself, why did the United States and the Soviet Union cooperate throughout the Cold War in Antarctica and outer space, despite the animosities that isolated them everywhere else? What enabled that? And initially, I thought it was science, that the science was what enabled that cooperation. Clearly, the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 emerged directly from the International Geophysical Year in 1957-58, when the first satellites were launched. The Antarctic Treaty specifically focused on international scientific cooperation. And I thought that the international scientific cooperation was the basis for many years. And that was the essence of thinking about science diplomacy. What is science diplomacy? How does it operate? What are the scales, contributions? And it was those early questions, 1981, when scuba diving under the ice. The following year, with a sense of responsibility and understanding, per se, having lived off the earth for an entire year, I began teaching at UCLA as a visiting professor when I was 23. And so the journey that I'm sharing with you is lifelong learning, in terms of how we as individuals can contribute to the resilience and sustainability of our world on a planetary scale forever into the future. That's been my journey as an individual. And I'm, it's honored truly to be able to share observations about science diplomacy, truly. So I would be remiss if I didn't at least provide a framework of what science diplomacy is. And in a sense, terms become jargon if they're not well defined. And they don't have to be uniformly defined. They just have to be defined in the context of the individuals that are speaking. What do they mean by science diplomacy? How is it interpreted in their view? Which is all fine. It's inclusive in that context. But in this sense, for me, defining science diplomacy, for one, I view it as a language of hope. A language of hope in contrast, intentionally, but in contrast to a language of fear, which dominates the world currently. A language of fear in terms of nationalism, stepping away from the realities of our globally interconnected civilization. Those were the root causes of world wars in the 20th century. Nationalism with advanced technologies and industrial capacities is a recipe for global conflict. So my journey has been to think about why the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated continuously in Antarctica and outer space throughout the Cold War. What made that special? What made it possible? And so science diplomacy emerged, at least in my mind, as a holistic, international, interdisciplinary, inclusive process. It was a process. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't an objective. It was a process as a method. Skills can be trained with methods. Theories can be developed with methods involving informed decision-making. So after many years on this journey, the methodology appeared, and I wrote about it in a paper in Science in 2007 about the Antarctic Treaty propels science diplomacy. This process involving informed decision-making has as an objective to balance national interests and common interests, recognizing the world that we have is occupied by nations. 30% of the surface of the earth is occupied by nations. But after the Second World War, international spaces, starting with the high seas, then Antarctica, then the outer space and the deep sea, were created, established by humanity. And so we have this balance between national interests and common interests. So the challenge and the responsibility, in a sense, is to help balance national interests and common interests. We, as scientists, don't have the capacity to make the decisions. So how do we contribute? How do we help balance national interests and common interests? And the challenge and the responsibility we have is to build common interests. In the absence of common interests, it's impossible to develop balance. And inward looking, the exclusive approaches of nations today is dangerous. It avoids and prevents the development of common interests, where balance is required to steer a sustainable path into the future. And ultimately, this process of science diplomacy with informed decision-making has as a goal for the benefit of all on Earth across generations. The context of all is inclusive. The mountains, the rocks, the fish, the birds, including the people, and everything else on Earth. We as stewards have responsibility to think about and to help preserve and to sustain on a planetary scale. And so this was, in a sense, my journey with science diplomacy. And I have a few other things I can share with you just briefly. This was the 2010 meeting at University of Cambridge, and it involved 4 ministries in Russia, representative of the president of the Russian Federation, along with ministers and ambassadors and high officials, as well as scientists and others from 17 countries in 2010 at the University of Cambridge. That dialogue, for me, opened a door, a window into dynamics of superpowers, which is an ongoing observation. And there was a recent news perspective in Nature about NATO and science, being topical, thinking about how science diplomats can operate, contribute. They interviewed me for this NATO and science news article because of this workshop, the first and only formal dialogue between NATO and Russia regarding security in the Arctic. And if you look in the news, and you can see all over the place the absence of any such discussions today. And so the observation I made in that, and I'll end with that, is that open science is akin to free speech, and undermining open science is detrimental to democracy. And we, as a community, have a responsibility to both to preserve as well as enhance open science on a global scale for the benefit of all on Earth across generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. It was really impressive journey that you have gone through, accomplishing all these high goals, science diplomacy, and looking into practice what science diplomacy can manage. That is great accomplishment. We have a few minutes. I hope you are going to stay with us a few minutes.
I can stay for a few minutes. I try to be on time, but I'm
thank you very much for giving time of your very busy day, traveling day actually. Thank you very much. We hope to have another opportunity also to meet you and discuss you and with you and having Q&A maybe in another session.
The nature of a dialogue is not just not a one-off. A dialogue has the impression of continuity. So it would be an honor as well as a pleasure.
Just I would like just to ask you a question. What are the challenges these days? What has changed since then? If things have been improved or getting worse since the first treaty? How do you see things evolving on the field of science diplomacy? Do you see more challenges these days than what it was before, or things are getting better or worse? What is your view?
I think trying to prognosticate and to anticipate has utility in terms of making decisions, to make an informed decision that operates short to long term. It's necessary to look into the future. But I would say the more important challenge is to imagine the types of solutions that are going to be necessary in any case, whatever the future holds. And the challenge is to be aware of the implications of the research with rigor in terms of the research, but also to be aware that data by itself is not evidence. Data is designed to answer questions with methods as elements of research, interpretation of the data, relation to the questions that were asked, hypotheses that were tested, for example. But data fundamentally is different than evidence. Evidence involves a decision, evidence for a decision. And the decision is made by individuals or institutions. And so the real challenge, and I have a slide somewhere in here I can show you. Here it is. The challenge is to understand that the role of a science diplomat, where the science diplomat can contribute, the methods and skills that are involved with science diplomacy, they operate across this data evidence interface. They operate from research, which is related to questions and methods and data, into actions that involve decisions. So evidence is for decisions necessarily involves the institutions or the individuals that make decisions. As a science diplomat, I'm not a decision maker. but I can contribute to the decision-making process across this data evidence interface, to interpret and to understand and to introduce options. Options are different than recommendations. Recommendations involve the appearance or actuality of advocacy, and advocacy involves agendas. And whenever there are agendas, there's political dynamics. Challenge of a diplomat is to avoid political dynamics. How do you do that? How do we do that? What is the enhancement we actually have as scientists to avoid political involvement? We can do that by being transparent, by understanding how the data becomes evidence in the context of institutions that make decisions. We can contribute to this by brokering dialogues among allies and adversaries alike between this action and research interface, data into evidence. And so to answer, that would be how I would answer your question.
It's great. It is it's continuous work and the dynamic involvement of some like live organism.
So, you know, it's interesting, the life organism part. So as part of our lives, we have a symbolism of a glass that's half full or half empty. And we recognize, we learn that in a sense, a glass that is half full is also half empty, that it's a choice that we make individually as to which it is. It could be both half full and half empty simultaneously, presumably, but the question is it half full or half empty? So it's a choice. And the observation at the beginning of any negotiation, so involved in talking with presidents and prime ministers and parliaments and such over the years, NATO Maritime Command with 100 admirals in the audience, 2 long rows of 50 admirals and the NATO Supreme Allied Commander at the end. Those types of discussions require a level of a choice. It's a choice, and understanding that choice is fundamental. There is a choice at the beginning of any negotiation. It's an option, it's a choice to begin the negotiation from a position of conflict or to begin the negotiation from a position of common interests. It's a choice, a fundamental choice. And I've had the opportunity to train several dozen diplomatic corps of several dozen nations over the years and through their ministries of foreign affairs. And an observation, whether it's right or wrong, is not quantified, but just a feeling, is that the emphasis on conflict resolution in terms of international relations is largely without a clear understanding of the option, the choice that's available with common interest building. And so a responsibility all by itself is to introduce in a transdisciplinary manner, holistic, international, interdisciplinary, inclusive manner, that there's a choice to begin a negotiation, any negotiation, to reset negotiations from positions of common interest or conflict. It's a choice. And those choices influence the dynamics that will happen after. If you choose a position, a direction of conflict, the journey will be filled with conflict. On the other hand, if you choose a path of common interest, the journey will be filled with cooperation, as was the lesson of the Antarctic Treaty and the Treaty of Outer Space in the 1950s and 1960s. Despite the animosity that isolated the 2 superpowers everywhere else.
Thank you very much for your insights. We definitely need your advice of how to build good science diplomacy and good science diplomats, especially for younger people.
It's, you know, it's interesting. I would say specifically for the next generation science diplomats, the young people. I mean, I was 23 when I was a visiting professor. So I was a young person once myself. And I like to think I'm still young at heart. But the sense of advice, observation I made, if I were to look back, is that I was true to myself. I followed my intuition, and it made the difference. It's making the difference, I think. But I followed my intuition. So to follow your intuition to a significant extent involves ignoring the word no. When people or institutions or proposals or boards or whatever, the answer is no, in a sense, to follow your intuition means ignoring no.
To continue against all odds in a way, and to have the real, what you call intuition, and someone could call inspiration to continue, because this is what will feed the young scientists to follow this path. Thank you very much for a really exciting discussion that we would like to continue longer, and I'm sure we are going to have another occasion. Thank you very much for.
I know that with
I think Ralph is applauding. In the meantime, Giovanna, also our third speaker, has joined us. I hope you can hear us. Hello,
thank you very
Giovanna.
much, Deodata. I look forward to continuing the discussion, and please excuse my early departure.
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Journey to the
good
airport.
luck with your new endeavors, wherever you go.
Bye, Ralph. Nice to see you again.
Bye.
Bye, Paul.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Now I get to see everybody that's in the audience. Pleasure and honor. I would enjoy talking further. I just, that's the dialogue nature of science diplomacy, but onward. Thank you.
Thank you. We can continue with Ralph. We took 5 minutes because Paul was leaving, so we had to discuss a bit, but please, Ralph, share your screen and start with your presentation. You have normally 20 minutes.
Okay, I try to be brief and on time. It's always excellent to start after Paul. I really like his position. I really like his takes. So, can you see my screen? Yeah, perfect. I said I really like to follow up Paul. My short take on science diplomacy might sound like a contradiction to what Paul just said, but it's not. It's another perspective on the same thing, because my take on science diplomacy is very agenda-driven, so to say. First, I would like to say some introductory words about science diplomacy, because as far as I know, not everybody is fully involved in science diplomacy discussions, in the definition of science diplomacy, and so on. So I would like to give you a very short brief. Theodora, please stop me if this is a wrong take, on what science diplomacy is. Paul gave you a very deep dive in the, let's say, the essence, the heart of science diplomacy, and I dance a bit around on the narratives. So what I would like to start to is probably the thing when you just Google science diplomacy or definition of science diplomacy, you will find this. You will find a 2010 report from the Royal Society and the AAAS on science diplomacy. What you will find there, and it's a very short document, so you can download it, so it's worth to have a look at. You find the essential 3 definitions of science diplomacy. So science diplomacy is science in diplomacy, diplomacy for science, and science for diplomacy. In current discussions and on the background of the current developments, we are now on having finally also diplomacy in science, something that was always a bit neglected, but was always there. So we have this three main definitions. And what you also heard about, science diplomacy is quite a good thing. So science diplomacy, especially in the 2010 discussions, it was what the author Tim Flink, which I also already also highly recommend to read his text, called a silver bullet. So science diplomacy will save everything. It's the new approach. It's a soft power tool. We can solve nearly every problem in international relations with science diplomacy. I think there's a lot of rationale behind that, and this is the idea that we use science not only to solve global problems, but also to use science and diplomacy together to approach our challenges are very, in my opinion, very well thought out because of science. And this is the reason why I want to talk with you about the unique qualities of science. Why is science, when you compare it, for example, with culture diplomacy or sports diplomacy, a lot of different diplomacies you have in the field of international relations, why is science so unique? So I will briefly show you some unique, so to say, qualities or some unique, so to say, aspects of scientific communities. First, and this is some of this is very obvious, they are the main driver of innovation. Innovation happens inside of science communities. These are universities. These are, as Paul already mentioned, this could be indigenous communities. This could also be R&D departments in big companies. But in science communities, this is where at least technological innovation happens. They are also translators and adapters of global technology development. So whenever somebody else on the other side of the world got some new toy and you want that toy too, you need scientists for that translate you the development and also make it possible to adapt your own technology and technological abilities to create such a toy or ability, or even understand a new development like artificial intelligence. But scientific communities have a very specific and hardly interchangeable expertise. So it's not like you can just say, oh, we need any kind of scientists. We need special scientists. We need engineers, natural scientists, social scientists. We need philosophers. We need all different kinds to tackle different problems, especially in the technological sphere, but also in all other spheres. And this is hard to find. Also, scientific knowledge is locally based. So this is what a lot of societies tried. We just take the development from another country, the new technological development, and just implement it in our society. That doesn't work. You need locally based knowledge. And this is what your scientific community does. And also, a scientific community is in a whole market of demand for their expertise, also for their local based knowledge from the outside, because maybe somebody wants to invest in your country. This has some what I call necessities of freedom. So governments have very limited ability, or at least when they really want to take advantage of scientific communities, to limit or restrict their, so to say, practices. if you restrict communication and international exchange from scientific communities, these are essential for development. If you, for example, take a look at the current space program from India, it was, even if it was an essential achievement of Indian scientists, it could not happen without any exchange with scientists all over the world, or scientific knowledge all over the world. You have a very specific scientific language. This is hard to control. You just can't take an officer, sit him in a laboratory and say, no, you can't say that, or you can't say that. You can't control that. Most of the time, you don't even understand what they are talking. You need a space for scientific, at least, dissent. You can't just know, this is the new line. You have to only do this. Governments tried it and they all failed. You need dissent to progress. And you also give them access to data and knowledge resources. And if you won't do that, if you really want to try to restrict your scientific community, if they don't comply, they have a lot of exit strategies, as I said, with the global demand. So what I want to give you now are some examples how we can use this specificity of science diplomacy, or with the emphasis on science, to bypass the gatekeepers. To do this, what science diplomacy is most praised for, to make connections where usually connections are not possible. First, I want to give you an example how hard it is for even the most restrictive societies to control their scientific communities. This is the Republic of Korea. As you might know, the Republic of Korea wasn't a democracy forever, since they were a dictatorship, a military dictatorship with a lot of revolts. These are pictures from the April, so-called April Revolt in the 60s. You have a big student uprising, demanding democracy, demanding equal rights, criticizing the dictatorship and military regime. This was beat down hard, but even the democratic demands were not only denied, but also brutally tormented, literally, so to say, literally, but but also Park, the main figure here, couldn't really downsize or control the students, because he has a vision to make Korea a developed, modern, strong country. This is a picture from the 1980s, from the so-called June Revolution, where the constant uprising from students and the whole society at all led to a democratic society. But also to something else. This is the Global Innovation Index. When we look at the top 10, you will find the Republic of Korea. So, in a sense, Park was correct by not downsizing, controlling, or trying to diminish in any way the scientific communities, because this was the outcome: a thriving, innovative country. But there are other examples. You might know the Sesame Project, and I'm not a physicist. I'm very bad to know what these things are doing. Somebody please explain me. The Sesame Project is something very unique. It's a synchron light, I just spell it out, synchron light for experimental science and applications in the Middle East. The Sesame Collider is an project. It's using the hardware of a German collider that's called Bessie, which was transported and reinstated in the early 2000s in Jordan. It is the only facility in the Middle East of its kind. And what it does, it brings together parties, communities, states, especially in the current situation, which will never even talk in a normal diplomatic situation. You see Turkey, Cyprus, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Egypt, Iran, Pakistan. Most of these nations are more or less in a state of war. But in this collider, in this Sesame project, they cooperate. They still cooperate today, despite all the tensions. They still cooperate, they still have contact. So it's this science diplomacy project in Sesame, like CERN, for example, in Switzerland. And by the way, they are hugely intertwined. These projects show us a way to use science to bypass the diplomatic gatekeepers, to make talks possible. And even, and this is a huge thing, and this is what I want to show you with Korea, and even have a whole advantage for the whole area. The Middle East profits largely from this collider, profits largely from the cooperation from hostile nations. In a lot of ways, in a diplomatic way, in a scientific way, in an economic way. So you see, science diplomacy, especially science diplomatic infrastructure, also a thing Paul mentioned, has a huge impact in bypassing what I call the gatekeepers. But another thing, there's another aspect of science diplomacy. Not only the tensions between nations, but also problems like gender inequality could be, at least in my perspective, challenged with science diplomacy. It was a great honor. This is on the left, is Professor Retenzi, head of our chair. We have a great honor to work with the Mawazo Institute in Kenya, an institute for the advantage of female scientists all over Africa, not only Kenya. I would like to show you a video, I hope the sound works, which introduces the whole project by one of the co-heads of the Mawazo Institute, in my opinion, in a very good way.
African scientists are doing all sorts of cool work, interdisciplinary work, field bending work, and I think we have no idea what will come out of exploratory research necessarily. But then history has shown us the byproducts of this kind of work is crucial and feeds into the innovations of tomorrow. Mawazo is a Kiswahili word that means ideas or thoughts and thinking, and what's really interesting is often this has a negative connotation. So if you're somebody with a lot of mawazo swirling around in your mind, you're brooding, and often women are, very typecasted as kind of brooding. And my co-founder and I and our collaborators were thinking up the name for Mawazo. We loved the idea of taking that word and putting a positive spin on it, that women with ideas is something to be proud of, that having a head full of, thoughts and thinking is actually a positive thing. We have a big focus on science communication, public engagement, policy outreach. These future researchers, as future thought leaders, are really oriented towards the public sphere, are already sensitized to the idea that your research should have some relevance, some touch point to society at large. I really believe that the work that we do is important and often overlooked. Mawazo Institute is part of a big movement to think about how does homegrown knowledge, homegrown science play a part in the future of Africa.
So, what I find very interesting in this video is not only the approach to say we want to connect, build a network for female African scientists, because we know due to gender inequality, due to what the colleague mentions, due to stereotypes and so on, they have a lack of standing in the scientific community. Also, they interact with communities, they interact with so-called homegrown science, or what we would call open science. And this is a quick sketch from the Mawasa website. These are their principles, and we look at them. These are the principles of good science. So we have an interaction, a back and forth work of science diplomacy practices, working within communities, working for science, working for interactions, for diplomacies, because there are different African states or representatives of African states are working with each other, also serving their communities and serving for, so to say, good science. I'm already on the finishing line. These are some pictures from our workshop or our course. We have a 12-week course, The Introductions to Science and Tech Diplomacy, the New Geopolitics on Science, which started in October last year. It was a huge success. We had people from all over the world. We have also people sitting in the same room. And remember, this is not 2019 or something. This is 2023. We had representatives from Russia and representatives from Ukraine in the same room. We have Iranian people. We have Northern American representatives, people from the African Union, from Lebanon. We have a huge diversity of young scientists, or not only young scientists, of every age, of every descent. We had professionals, science advisors, and so on. And we worked together to understand the tools and the meaning of science and tech diplomacy together. So, to finalize everything, what I would like to do is changing the narrative. Science diplomacy, not only as a soft power tool for the international relations of the European Union, where it's often called, but also a tool for a people power movement. Innovation in science with and for science. And if you have any comments, questions, or friendly insults, I'm totally open to that. And if you are interested in the field and you want to have a very quick introduction, there is a new book, Science Diplomacy Foundation and Practices. You can find it on the website from the European Science Diplomacy Alliance, where, as mentioned, I'm a member. I will post the link in the chat. And it's free, and you can just download it, which is a good thing. So I'm looking forward to a question, and I hope I didn't take too much of your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ralph. That was really nice overview of science diplomacy in diplomacy and for diplomacy, and also giving the gender dimension there and the connectivity that can be established. So I suggest that we continue with Giovanna's talk, and then we take for both of you questions for the time that is left. So Giovanna, you will have welcome. I hope you can unmute just to test your microphone. Perfect. Welcome here, the webinar. I've already introduced you to the audience, but please go ahead, introduce yourself and start with your talk. You're going to have also 20 minutes, and then we will have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So the people already can start writing the questions on the chat so I can read them out. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction. Apologies for the slight delay that was fortunately announced, and I appreciate coordinating the process. I hope that everything is fine and the slides are also fairly visible and that you can hear me well. Very good. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, but also for the kind invitation. It is a real pleasure to take part in this initiative and complement some of the very inspiring interventions and overviews previously with the perspective on the Swiss Young Network for Science Policy and Diplomacy, abbreviated as SYNESPOD, that I've been invited to talk more about, while providing a a perspective of early career researchers in that context. So we live in very unusual times, as it has been also somewhat brought into context with the previous discussions from the ongoing pandemic through the climate emergency, a number of geopolitical crises, the emergence of AI and related technologies, which also makes this discussion particularly important, and I want to acknowledge that. Now, perhaps going back to the AI and different technologies, to put this also more concretely into context, if we are to ask some of the emerging technologies about this particular topic and the interface of science, policy, and diplomacy, we might come across one of the following illustrations. Seeing this lonely scientist at the center stage of what seems to be a sort of a decision-making table, bringing together different representatives from seemingly around the world, indicating Europe and beyond, addressing some of the pressing challenges, while served with what seems to be interesting scientific evidence that they do not seem particularly appealed by, or clearly ignoring, even turning very evidently the back on the scientist in the central stage, which from my perspective fairly appropriately illustrates some of the challenges associated with science advice in the context of science for policy and diplomacy, which I hope to tackle throughout discussions today. However, if we think about some of the pressing global challenges from the climate emergency or the healthcare crisis or the geopolitical crisis, water, food insecurity, or poverty, they're mostly requiring the interventions that involve science at the center in terms of the strategies and the capacities to address them, which is also well captured through the Sustainable Development Goals in the context of this framework introduced by the UN through the 17 interconnected goals that overall involve science across most of these goals for addressing some of the challenges associated with the sustainable development, which is also very appropriately emphasized through the latest report on the progress of these goals from the 2023 entitled Times of Crisis and Times of Change, that outlines the progress across different sustainable development goals, or the lack of thereof, emphasizing and calling for strengthening the role of science in accelerating this transformation to sustainable development, which makes this discussion even more important. And with that mindset, and considering also a very broad audience with very different perspectives when it comes to science for policy and diplomacy, and considering also the effort to engage in this interface across different generations, it is worth reflecting for a moment in what this particularly implies. What is this interface between science and policy, and which has been to an extent introduced previously, and I want to just briefly put everyone on the same page in the effort to also put SINESPOD into context. When we think about science policy or science for policy, it is important to recognize these two important pillars of using science-based evidence to inform policy in the context of science for policy, but also science policy with respect to policies that influence scientific enterprise as a complementary perspective that also come into play together with the science diplomacy that has been previously primarily addressed, including these three pillars that are already introduced, being science for policy, science for diplomacy, science in diplomacy, but also diplomacy for science, and the importance of diplomatic efforts in fostering these diplomatic relationships and collaborations, which collectively define this science policy interface with all its complexities, including a number of different stakeholders operating, which is here very nicely illustrating, including those from the scientific academies, research institutes, individual scientists, academies, brokering programs, policy, fellowships, think tanks, or on the other hand, also governmental units contributing to the even governmental laboratories and research, conventional chief scientific advisories, and many others that collectively form the science policy interface. And in order to engage and better understand its complexity, especially from the perspective of early career researchers, it is worth considering some of the relatively simplified but helpful models to perhaps navigate this space that I would like to briefly address in order to put all this into context. And they are typically associated with these very now dynamic landscape of different manners that the science and policy interacts, or science and diplomacy interacts within this space, which can be very linear when we think about the traditional mechanism for science advice and relying on science-based evidence in policy or diplomacy, that is this push-pull system where a specific matter or question emerges that requires scientific intervention, where through this push-pull interaction, a scientific advisory process leads to a specific advice that may or may not be considered in the resulting policies. Well, the dynamics of our time call for the changes in this process of not only interaction, but the implementation on some of the different policies, or how they shape this particular process through different, for instance, relational exchange interactions, having defined emergence of defined existing interfaces through continuous exchanges for emerging problems, that are not only necessitated by the appearance of particular urgent issues, which we can see through the UN framework as a good example, having the IPCC facilitating, for example, some of these interactions between continuously science and policy, and also relevant at the global scale with respect to science diplomacy. But even more importantly, evolving towards more systems-based integrated approaches, where the existence of specific relationship brokers further facilitates this process, facilitating continuous exchanges and interactions, and contributing to building trust that is the necessity and the basis for ultimately science or best science-informed policies or diplomatic efforts. Now, when we think about the role of scientists in this context, they're also rather dynamic. And most of them are very much focused on the science practitioner side of the interactions, focused in particular fields and producing research or knowledge that can be policy relevant or relevant for different science policy contexts. But increasingly with the dynamics of the world we operate, and this includes a number of science communicators that bridge beyond their particular scientific disciplines, including also a more general public, as well as policymakers, where these knowledge or honest brokers become particularly important, as the traditional science advisory roles, where now engaged by the policymakers directly contributes to informing policies based on science-based evidence, and similarly in the diplomatic interactions contributes to being science-based policy informing, but non-policy prescriptive, so independent and impartial, which however becomes increasingly challenging considering the nature of the issues we're addressing at the moment globally, particularly, for instance, considering the climate emergency, that with the conflict of the timescales of being addressed potentially even interferes with our existence as a species, making us thereby all collectively very impartial, which leads to many scientists increasingly involved in the roles of also issue advocates. So clearly taking a stance on particular issues and even navigating towards advocacy and even activism when it comes to contributing to the space, which also has a role to play. Now, generally, this poses a number of important challenges that emerge from different misalignments associated with this interaction, from misalignment of culture and values, complexity of the process, different communication strategies, interference with the timelines, lack of incentives, or perhaps even misuse of science and instrumentalization that can be problematic in conventional science advice for science for policy, but also science diplomacy, and which also stimulated our involvement when conceptualizing the Swiss Young Network for Science Policy and Diplomacy, aiming to provide a better understanding and more involvement from the perspective of early career researchers, which has been established from 2023 together with a number of my colleagues at the Swiss Young Academy, who come from very different disciplines and backgrounds of natural, social sciences, and engineering, and building on also the environment and the commitments and to this particular topic within the Swiss ecosystem that I believe it's worth maybe emphasizing for context, recognizing also the importance of science diplomacy as an agent for peace, and using it to meet different global challenges, which has also in 2021 resulted in our Federal Council appointing a special representative for science diplomacy, which then triggers a number of programs that are relevant in this context, contributing to the developments of the capacity, impact, and also overall commitments to the different sustainable development goals. Now, with that, we have been greatly motivated to contribute to addressing some of these challenges that affect Switzerland beyond its borders, considering all these global challenges, and which require really interventions at the interface of science, policy, and diplomacy, providing the opportunities to contribute through both the science policy dialogue as well as broader international cooperation, which has been really at the core of the also Swiss Young Academy's main priorities, reflected in a number of complementary prior initiatives, including one of them being the Who Gets Heard project that has been exploring the process of engaging scientific experts in the Swiss legislatory process, for example, which has now translated this motivation into a broader vision to establish a platform for science for policy and diplomacy through activities and partnerships, both nationally and internationally, with the objective to increase the capacity, visibility, but also impact of early career researchers and academics more broadly within Switzerland, as well as internationally, who could then better contribute to addressing the challenges towards especially sustainable development goals, which has been realized by translating this into two groups of activities, namely those that primarily focus on capacity building, mostly in the science for policy space, developing different trainings and workshops on the Swiss political system and effective communication in collaboration with a number of organizations within Switzerland, including the Swiss Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Geneva Science Policy Interface, and a think tank operating in this space, REACH, but also science diplomacy in the context of strengthening also our collaborations and contributing to different national and international platforms and events with other young academies, such as the Global Young Academy, the also broadly European network of young academies of Sweden, Finland, and others, while teaming up also with the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator, or GESDA, one of the important relationship brokers in that context, operating in international Geneva, and other think tanks such as FODAUS, to further strengthen the involvement of early career academics within that interface. Now, I would like just to provide you with a few highlights and examples of this initiative, as we have organized a number of workshops on science for policy, but also science diplomacy in different languages, including where language becomes an also delicate question when it comes to science advisory, which we realized, at least within the Swiss landscape, dedicating the early workshops to French and German, and since recently also organizing workshops in English in collaboration with REACH, but also Geneva Science Policy Interface for early career researchers across different disciplines. In the context of some of the broader network establishment, we have been collaborating with a number of academies, including also the European Network of Young Academies, where we have last year in Stockholm contributed to the Stockholm Charter for Academic Freedom, and have been involved in the latest ENIA meeting in Berlin, discussing the importance of these collaborations in a dynamic geopolitical landscape. We're also very pleased to be hosting the next ENIA meeting in Bern next year, which will also be focused on the topic of science diplomacy, which is perhaps another tribute to the increasing importance of this particular topic. Furthermore, we have been strengthening the interactions and relationship with other collaborators, including those from the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator, where here I provide a few highlights, such as contributing to the session organized last year together with the Interparliamentary Union at CERN, discussing the relationship between science and parliaments, or organizing more interactive sessions that stimulate creativity and interaction across disciplines, such as those organized around the game, the Think from the Future, on the topic of science diplomacy and emerging technologies, in order to stimulate not only the understanding of the science diplomacy and the ongoing challenges, but stimulate anticipatory science diplomacy concepts through these networkings and networking initiatives and exchanges. Now, ultimately, this led to a growing collaborative network over the past 2 years, including a number of different partner organizations and academies, which here some of the highlighted contributors to some of our discussions and events, discussing generally not just challenges for involvement, but also opportunities to strengthen this network and further build the capacity and impact of early career researchers within that space, more interdisciplinarily, but also with certain disciplinary focus, such as with the involvement in climate policy through contributions to COP events, or, for example, the upcoming World Biodiversity Forum in Davos. As a result, we are very pleased to have been earlier this year also recognized as one of the important programs within the Swiss science diplomacy ecosystem, as summarized by one of the policy briefs from the Swiss Tropical Institute, which really stimulates our further engagement within that space. So with that, I would like to just briefly summarize that SNASPOD has really provided us with an interesting platform for science for policy and diplomacy within Switzerland, but also bringing together different international academies and organizations, especially in the context of early career researchers, contributing to building their capacity, visibility, and impact, which will continue with a number of trainings and workshops over the upcoming period with our collaborators within Switzerland so far, while we're at the same time involved in summarizing some of this knowledge through exchanges by mapping the science policy interface for educational offers in Switzerland and Europe, which I will be glad to share with you, hopefully as the report is finalized by the end of the year, while continuing to nurture these international connections and contributing to these platforms while engaging other young academics in the process. So I look forward to the continuation of these initiatives and use this opportunity to also invite everyone who is attending this webinar or listening in later on, who is interested to reach out, as we're happy to exchange and expand this to also new collaborations. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your kind attention, and I very much look forward to the continuation of our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanna. That was a nice insights that you gave, connecting science, diplomacy, and also your organization that is it's basically coming from Young Academy, right? The Swiss Young Academy, but focusing on science diplomacy. That shows the important role that plays for young scientists and all young people. So that's perfect. Now we have about more than 10 minutes for questions, and please type your questions if you have, and maybe I can start with some questions, since we are talking about how to help young scientists to obtain these skills and knowledge that is necessary to be involved with science diplomacy. I think, Giovanna, you already referred to workshops and conferences, or a lot of young people are. What is your feeling? What is needed to be done?
Well, thank you so much for this question. I think in general, capacity building is one of the important aspects for facilitating the involvement. And from my perspective, also considering the importance of trust in science to really make these interactions at the science policy or science diplomacy interfaces effective is very relevant, because through involvement of early career researchers or professionals and training them to really be effectively involved, we enable this interaction to be nurtured through a longer period of time, which is also something that is perhaps very important in that context. So there are different opportunities for capacity building. I think they're increasingly emerging in Europe, and perhaps Ralph wants to add something to that, especially from the European Science Diplomacy Alliance that I've been very keenly following and really impressed with by a lot of initiatives. The young academies are increasingly organizing a number of webinars, workshops, or training programs, and there are other initiatives across Europe and worldwide that have a certain tradition and that are continuously opening different opportunities for trainings and programs that are also very often even free, and people have the opportunity to really get engaged to understand a bit more broadly this particular question and the opportunities for involvement. I hope this offers some ideas moving in this direction.
Thank you, Giovanna. I think Ralph is also one of the experts for the European capacity building, so participating in the discussions, because this is exactly the crucial role that plays the capacity building in the European Union. Please, Ralph, you can just comment. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Giovanna. This was a great introduction to the project and what is happening in Great Switzerland, especially all the different aspects. And we already mentioned CERN, one of the major European scientific infrastructures. There's a reason why it's located in Switzerland. So thanks a lot for the insight. Regarding the European science diplomacy capacity building or the capacity right now, what we are currently having is a lot with not enough networking in my at least in my perspective. We have a lot of science diplomacy. This is one of the reasons why I'm in this working group of the European Commission, because the European Commission, the European Union is seeing the importance for capacity building, especially with younger scientists, as an outreach, but also as a networking within Europe. So there's a huge demand and a huge interest in it. When you just look at the website of the European Science Diplomacy Alliance, you see a lot of workshop, conferences, symposia, already, and also this workshop here, or this seminar here is also mentioned, but we are currently not having much interaction. So there's a lot to find. There's a lot, so to say, there's a lot offered, but I think what we need is a more combined effort. What we need is a more interaction. What we need is more also discussing about science diplomacy, about the, sorry to again contradict Paul a bit, of the agendas of science diplomacy and what we want to do with it. So in my opinion, the best thing you can do right now as a young person in science is to engage in science diplomacy wherever you find it, and go to the website. There are webinars, there are conferences, there are calls, and just do it. What Giovanna pointed out is that science diplomacy is a practice. It's a framework, it's an idea, yes, but it's first of all a practice. You have to do it. And all the examples I brought to the table, they all were practices. Yes, I know Sesame is an infrastructure and so on, but it lives from the practice. It lives from the commitment of the scientists who work there. So thanks again for the great insights, Switzerland and Swiss science diplomacy.
And maybe it's worth just commenting. I really appreciate what you said in terms of the need for strengthening the networks, as I think this was one of the very important motivations for us, and we realized the importance of it, as there are a lot of parallel initiatives that, and a lot of redundancy without often having the capacity to then, or resources to reach more broadly. So we really felt that this was an important element, and we have really learned a lot through exchanges with other academies, through exchanges with other organizations trying to pursue, and also teaming up in order to really facilitate these exchanges and lessons learned, and addressing different challenges across Europe and more internationally. So I hope that and I'm glad that this resonates also with what you're saying from the perspective of the, for instance, European Science Diplomacy Alliance, hopefully also strengthen some of these connections, so that this can really contribute to not only capacity building, but again, building these strong relationships and trust in science, which I really believe could eventually make a difference in terms of the impact of science diplomacy as a practice, as you're emphasizing. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. So we have also a question from Eileen Gute from the audience. that is connected with a question that I had given you. That is how educational institutions can incorporate start incorporating science diplomacy in their curricula. So the question from Ellen is, what is your point of view, actually, how you discuss how we can have support from mid-career, from mid-career senior scientists, that they are in position to influence graduate programs, and how is their interest on teaching and efforts like that, so that young scientists are enabled, and as you said, the outreach, how you can reach the young scientists, that is the most difficult part.
I can maybe briefly comment on that, if that's okay. I think that there is a great interest for having not just science for policy, but in particular science diplomacy as part of a general curricula. And there are a number of challenges there, as this is often the case, thinking about both national and international perspectives and formulating this in the context of different programs that tackle this. And I just want to emphasize that there are some of the organizations that are pursuing this more broadly in terms of attempts to bring together different organizations to bring forward some of these ideas on global curricula, for example, in science diplomacy. One of them is the Geneva Science Diplomacy Anticipator, who have just last year during their summit announced this initiative for building a global curriculum in science diplomacy, trying to now act as this relationship broker, bringing together different contributors to the space and trying to facilitate the process of establishing more effectively. In parallel, there are a number of different universities that have been trying to proactively implement this. We've been trying to learn a lot from there are initiatives in the UK that I'm familiar with, although also in Finland, for example, with their Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, who have been implementing different creative programs to educate early career and young academics and science diplomacy. So there are a number of emerging opportunities which are worth also maybe looking into for implementing more better programs. When you think about the impositions of influence, I think in general, it's worth mentioning that maybe one of the challenges for involvement within this space is not necessarily capacity building, because there are a number of now emerging programs and initiatives, and this is increasingly the case, but also incentivizing involvement. I think from the student perspective, from the perspective of early career researchers, there is often this question of why they should be incentivized to get involved in the first place. We do see the importance of the global impact, and many of us who are involved within these activities are self-motivated by all the challenges and having a greater impact within this community. But at the same time, academic systems will not necessarily always incentivize thinking more broadly in terms of bridging these disciplinary boundaries. So I just want to mention that perhaps in many different career levels, we also have perhaps a certain responsibility or a question to reconsider on how we may want to challenge this culture in terms of incentivizing further by engaging people beyond the conventional academic system in terms of how this is perceived or rewarded or recognized in the general academics pursuit. So I am optimistic, and I see with the early career academics, this culture is certainly changing. So I'm in that sense optimistic that this will stimulate more young researchers to get engaged.
So it's important, these academies and non-governmental organizations that exist, like also we are trying to do this in MCAA framework, for example. But we need more collaboration, more networking between us. Maybe we can have a last question, because the time is closing, but I hope we will have another opportunity for just open discussion about these topics. And please send your slides if you want, and links that you would like, so that other people can connect with you. So the question from Monica is, can you suggest a few opportunities for scientists from Global South to get first-hand experience in EU science diplomacy? Maybe we start with Ralph, and then Giovanna, and then we can close if there is no question.
Thank you. So first, what you said, Giovanna, I can totally underlined the importance of having this science diplomacy frameworks, the possibility to do science diplomacy. And I would like to add, we should have in a not so far future science diplomacy as a part of the curriculum for nearly all sciences, as a part of, like today, science communication is already a part of a lot of things, like project management now is a part of, for example, engineering. As a basic skill, because they need project management, scientists on large need science diplomacy. And to address the question of Monica Yagi, as I mentioned, we have not now, hopefully soon, established network for science diplomacy, capacity building, or science diplomacy, so to say, training. What I would suggest, go to, for example, I'm doing a bit of advertising here, go to the Science Diplomacy EU website and look at the seminars. Science diplomacy, when you go to a webinar, there are also summer schools there and so on. This is already EU science diplomacy. Connecting there, going there, finding people for, I don't know, a PhD project, finding people for a collaborative project, for interaction, for another course, as a guest lecturer, whatever. This is already science diplomacy. So I would highly suggest, before looking for, I'm citing Tim Flink again, looking for the silver bullet, for the best thing and so on, just do it. Like this thing here. Interact with the people, interact with representatives, exchange emails. Do it simple, but do it. Science diplomacy is based on practice, not on frameworks, not on any certain. By the way, we are working on certifications in science diplomacy, but this is not the end. This is the beginning, and practice is what you should do. So I can highly, 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 if you got the means, encourage you to go in any kind of school, conference, and so on, or at a webinar, or at a talk, online talk. I think this is one of the good things that the recent developments brought, that a lot of things are hybrid now. So it's easy to get in touch with people you would never have been able to get in touch with before. I hope that addresses a bit the question.
Yeah. And these days there are a lot of webinars as we do today, but all over the space, so that just get informed and just read whatever comes in your hands or in your eyes. So that get informed, get the information, and slowly you get to understand more. It's really exciting and involves everybody. So that was the last question that I had. The goal is to cultivate a more inclusive and impactful approach to science diplomacy, so we can foster collaboration, innovation, and equitable participation, and especially among women scientists that often are marginalized in very competitive environments like policy. So connected science diplomacy. So how you can affect policies, how you can affect the future of this world. So that is maybe the good way to close the meeting. So this is what we should try to cultivate networks and more inclusiveness, especially for young scientists in the topic of science diplomacy. And I hope that we will meet again. Just send me, I will be in touch with you so we can propagate the information so the people can get in touch with you. So thank you very much, everybody in the audience. Thank you very much. I hope that all of you had really appreciated our speakers' presentations and the discussion. And please contact also Switzerland chapter, whoever is in MCAA, to get more information, so I can provide you even more links and information about the speakers. Thank you very much. I hope that we will be able to write a blog or something in our newsletter. So probably I will contact you for some kind of interview or summary in a few days. Thank you very much, Ralph, Giovanna. Of course, we thank Paul. That was especially nice to have his narrative. And it was exactly the same question that I posed to him when I met him. It is what skills are needed. And he told me exactly what Ralph said, that is practice. So it's mainly by his experience, how he got involved. He started as a scientist, but he went even to the treaties, Arctic treaties, and talked with Russian in NATO framework that is highly complex. So don't be discouraged. So continue this path, what inspires you, and bring science and diplomacy together, the two words. That's very exciting for the future world. Thank you very much. Have a nice weekend, and bye to everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much for organizing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for your time.